Today I'm going to talk about network theory and urban design. And I'm not an urban design person. I'm not a network theoretician. I'm a population biologist and population geneticist. I really focus my research and my lab's research on understanding how species remain connected in space and in time. And to do that, mostly I study a process we call gene flow. And that's the movement of genetic material across the landscape from one location to another. Now, in my lab, we've worked at this at several spatial levels and temporal levels as well, from large continental scales to what I'm going to talk about today, which is at the region of a small urban and industrial area in a city called Richmond, Virginia. If you're a bicycle racing fan, that's where the UCI races are happening this week, and I happen to be here. So we're going to talk about that in the context of how the spatial arrangement of features within the urban landscape influence the movement of genes. And this is essentially a transportation kind of question, a movement of information, how agents move across the landscape. When I look at the evolution of a species or its ability to evolve under changing situations such as under climate change, we need to kind of conceptualize that in two space, similar to this fitness landscape here. And what this is a DEM, a topography colored by some feature of a species, where the colors indicate where the species is, and the brownness to the greenness indicate the relative fitness of these species. Now, a fitness of an individual, of an organism, is a property of several interacting processes. There are several environmental landscape features that an organism interacts with on a daily basis. If you're a tree, you're trying to gain nutrients from the soil and water. You're trying to exchange gases with the air. And so there's this kind of interaction between the genetic architecture and its spatial arrangement on the landscape, the phenotypic architecture, its interaction with the environment that makes the fitness. And the important thing here is that much of the genotypes that we have in the landscape, for a lot of species that we're dealing with now, as we're modifying the environment, the amount of the genetic variation that we have is probably all we're going to have. Okay, so essentially I'm going to talk a little bit about the biology, the biological kind of constraints that organisms may have. We're going to talk about pollination networks, and these are really exciting and kind of challenging transportation problems that we've been playing with. And then I'll close up with some consequences for managers or stakeholders who may want to think about this as we design landscapes at larger spatial scales. We're above the scale of a building or a transportation route. So if I'm an insect, there are some obvious kind of features in the landscape. Here's the raster of the buildings. Obviously, as we said before, they obviously don't go through the wall of a building. So those are obvious things that we can look at the landscape. Less obvious things, though, are the impervious surfaces. So how does an insect, let's say a bee or a fly or a wasp, how does it perceive open areas? Is a small road and a big road a sidewalk? Do they even perceive that at all? Then we have other things like the tree layer here, the canopy layer, and the non-canopy layer. You know, there's open grassland that's available. That may be a more suitable habitat for them to fly across than a canopy layer here. Essentially, we're going to try to decompose this tree canopy layer and these vegetation layers and some of the more stark components here to figure out how important they are relative to each other for explaining the observed distribution of pollen that has moved across the landscape. Okay, so the main questions that I'm going to talk about today is what features of the landscape are important in predicting this level of genetic connectivity, and can we identify the strength at which they occur? And if we can do that, we can actually develop a predicted resistance model for connectivity based upon how we design our urban landscapes. That would be a predictive tool that could be useful for understanding the extent to which we are restricting pollinators from moving. There exists a whole host of paths that exist between two places. I can walk over to this blue, either directly over that blue dot, or I could walk many other routes across this stage to get to that blue dot. If I want to look at kind of measuring the distance, either physically or through some ecological characteristic from me to that place over there, I may need to take into account all of those other routes that would be possible. And my selection of whether I choose to walk directly here or meander back to my hotel depends upon what I'm doing and what environment that I'm in. And it's the same with insects and plants and animals as they move genetic material or individuals across a landscape. So as we estimate kind of the physical distances between these things, or the ecological distances, or the urban structural distances between these locations that we're sampling the genetic material, we need to use both least costs as well as random paths approaches for that, because we don't know which approach the organism is going to use. And in taking into consideration all of these things, we can go ahead and build a resistance model that describes kind of the estimated pollination movements across the landscape. These dispersal routes depicted over here, you can see the darker spaces of the trees, and you can see at where the organisms are preferring to move relative to the features we've identified as being important. Now, in the construction of this, we used both the physical features of the environment, the buildings, the roads that were important and statistically significant, as well as the abiotic features that I showed you here. I think I'm going to wrap that up. Thank you for your time. And kind of the connectivity that we see is very site-specific. And the physical matrix may not be just a set of buildings or just having plants in some places. Not all green space species are equal, and many are detrimental for the functional connectivity. And the idea of these genetic neighborhoods being different sizes and different extents can be used to manage the landscapes as we develop them, as long as we are cognizant that they're dynamic itself.